I'm sure you've heard me say this before, but possibly the most disturbing thing about Christianity is that it might actually be true. You know, that if you compare Christianity to every other religion has some sort of prophet who comes to speak on behalf of God, telling us how to be good. And we can sort of sit there and say, well, there's elements of truth there. You know, whether it's real or not, we can get some benefit from it. But Christianity makes such a bold claim that God has actually come down to us, that God has become human. Jesus declares himself to be divine. And so really, there is no middle ground. It's either true or it's not. You know, if Jesus is not God, then he's crazy. We should not be listening to him. And so it's very black and white, really, in our response here. And as I say, perhaps the most troubling thing is that maybe it is actually correct. Because if this is true, that God actually has come into the world, that changes everything. You know, if you actually stop and think about the implications of that, that opens up a whole new reality of what our life is meant to be, why we exist, what we're meant to do with our time here. That we are now meant to live for him, to live worshipping him, because this glory has been revealed in our midst. Now, this is where it gets uncomfortable, because as human beings, there is something where we are very naturally spiritual. It's kind of written into us that we are looking for something religious. We seem to turn everything into a religion, even if it's football. But at the same time, there is also something in us which is deeply rebellious, that we don't actually want to submit to anybody. We would rather be the one on the throne being worshipped. And so this is where we approach our faith in this kind of dilemma. Part of us is deeply attracted to it. We're looking for something spiritual, but at the same time, we're almost trying to step away from the reality because we're afraid that that might mean that I've got to get off the throne and let God actually be God in my life. And so we can end up trying to sit in this middle ground where everything's a little bit uncertain and grey. You know, as much as you're all here on a Sunday morning because you believe, that there is a degree to which all of us are a little bit agnostic. You know, meaning that we kind of sit in this space where we're comfortable not really being fully sure whether it's true. Now, I've got to explain what I mean by this. So if you go back to this gospel we've just heard, Jesus stands up and starts preaching, and people are amazed. They're astounded because his preaching is different to all the other religious preaching. They're used to seeing the Jewish priests and leaders stand up and say nice things about God. And as a priest, I can say it's very tempting to get up here and just say something nice about God. Something that's not confronting, something that doesn't cause you to want to change your life. And yet Jesus comes up and says something very different. He reveals a word which compels people. They walk away realizing this has to be true and therefore I have to change. And human beings don't like changing. Now, this is where even those who were professional religious, they start to feel a bit uncomfortable with this. You know, it's interesting when you look at the beginning of the gospel, everyone is astounded and amazed by the teaching of Jesus. But it doesn't take long for them to then become really angry at the teaching of Jesus. Because as soon as someone starts to compel us to make a decision, to say that this actually is so true that your life needs to therefore change, at that point we rebel. We get angry. We don't like that. And so the very people who were standing here amazed at his teaching, are the same people who will very soon start calling for him to be crucified. We don't like the fact that this might actually be real. Now, I've seen this so many times in conversations with faithful Catholics down the years, that there is always a point where we start to get a bit uncomfortable. So, for example, when people talk about miracles or miraculous healings, if the story is a little bit ordinary, you know, like I had the flu and I prayed and I was healed, people are happy with that. Because it's like, well, you probably would have got better anyway. And so if calling it a miracle makes you feel good, then good for you. But as soon as someone tells a story which could only be true if the power of God was at work, suddenly people get a little bit uncomfortable. And I've seen this many times. You know, where if something can't be explained by science, suddenly the conversation kind of stops, or people change the conversation. Because it might actually reveal that God is in our midst, and that's a little bit confronting. Or take, for example, here Jesus is casting out a demon, a man who, you know, has been possessed. Now, once again, we normally hear these sort of stories and we like to jump to a scientific conclusion. Maybe it was just some medical condition, or maybe it was a psychological condition. As long as it's not real. If we can keep it in that slightly agnostic space, we're comfortable. Now, as a priest, I have seen things over the years which I can't explain scientifically, you know, and I'm pretty much a rational skeptic at heart. But there are many things I've encountered where I've walked away and I've said, the only way I can explain that is that evil spirits exist and Jesus has authority to cast them out. And that's really disturbing. You know, I've walked away amazed, but also confronted, because I realized that if that's real, all of it's real. And therefore, how do I respond to that? If the power of God is in our midst, then my life needs to change accordingly. You know, even when we talk about how people respond to the call of Jesus. You know, this second reading, St. Paul's talking about how some people are so convicted to serve God that they would give their whole lives, choose not to get married, and live completely 100% for Jesus. Now, in our church, often we hear these stories of people going to become priests or nuns. And once again, I think there is a space where we're comfortable with someone making that decision if they had no other option. You know, if they never had any chance of getting married, they were kind of not intelligent, they couldn't get a job, then the church is a good place for them. But if someone was successful, intellectual, amazingly good looking, and they decide to become celibate to follow the kingdom, there's almost something in us that gets angry. Because we're like, surely that's wrong. Surely this can't be that real, that you would make such a stupid decision. There's always some place where we get a little bit uncomfortable that this might actually be correct. And I think this is the space where we need the Holy Spirit to really convict us. We need this grace of faith to break through that fear, to break through the unbelief, to break through the rebellion in our hearts, and actually reveal to us the truth of Jesus Christ. That God has come into our midst and revealed himself in his full power. And to have the courage to start to then think, well, how does that then change the rest of my life? What would it look like if I actually placed Jesus at the center and my life was now about worshipping him rather than worshipping myself? In the psalm, we had that response where it simply said, if today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. The Holy Spirit is speaking to each one of us, convicting us every single day, every moment. And yet often we are hardening our hearts because we're afraid of where the Spirit is actually calling us to. So let's really pray for that courage, that we would not harden our hearts, that we could encounter the truth, the authority of Christ, and have that courage to really respond by giving our whole lives for him.